This is a follow-up video to my previous video on gluing up segmented rings using epoxy resins. In this video I'll complete the process of gluing up segmented rings to produce this tornado pattern bowl using epoxy resin for all the gluing operations. The idea of using epoxy for these operations was first suggested to me at a recent AAW meeting by several other segmented wood turners. The comments from these other wood turners that the glue joints of the segment rings were stronger and the splitting of the joints was eliminated when using the epoxy resin glues. After some initial experimentation using epoxy resins to glue up the segments for segmented wood turning, I've been quite pleased with the results of this technique. Yes, it is sloppier than using type-on glue, but you have an hour of setup time before the glue starts to set, which can be quite beneficial. The main disadvantage is the drying time is at least 4 hours, and preferably one should allow the pieces to harden and cure overnight. Now this is the epoxy I chose to use. It's made by Aero Marine. It's a 2-to-1 mix and it's fairly thin, and I pre-prepared 2 beakers here. These are disposable plastic beakers, and in the one I used 40 mils and the other I used 20 mils, and I'll mix these together. And this other plastic disposable beaker. And then we'll mix this thoroughly. I pre-prepared some of my blocks that I'm going to glue together. These are some 18 segments per ring blocks of alternating woods. I have a 4-inch, a 4-inch, and a 3¼ inch diameter disc. And I'm just using an acid brush to glue these up. And I prepared these by putting a piece of tape upside down and then attaching the wood to that so it sort of sticks together until it sets. And I did put some wax paper down here to keep the table clean, make cleanup a little bit easier. The setup time for this glue is at least half an hour, so I have a fair amount of time to do quite a few discs here. After applying epoxy to all the gluing surfaces, the tape edges were cut and the ring of wedges was rolled into a cylindrical shape. I chose to remove the masking tape so that it would not get glued to the wedges, since it would be difficult to remove later. The segmented ring of wedges is then clamped using a rubber band. Additional rubber bands are then added for increased clamping pressure. Got some larger rubber bands here that I can double up and get a lot more tension on it. I do prefer using rubber bands rather than clamps because it gives you a nice even pressure all around the disc. So that's glued up now. I'll just set that aside and let it dry. The second and third segment rings are glued up with epoxy in the same manner. I applied epoxy to both sides of the wedges. However, this was definitely too much epoxy. In the future I will use less epoxy and will only apply the epoxy to one of the surfaces of each wedge. Also in the future, I will not be using the masking tape. As shown in the other video, I can just apply the epoxy to the wedges, set them in place in a cylindrical pattern, and then clamp them with rubber bands. This is possible due to the longer setting time for the epoxy as compared to the type-on glues. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to make a bowl, one of these tornado pattern bowls from these discs that I made, and these have been sanded. So I'm going to cut these into, I think, probably 75 thousandths inch thick sections, and then make a tornado pattern out of it. I'm going to start off by smoothing out the inside of this ring so that it'll go over a disc such as this. And the reason I do that is because after I cut these rings off, I can put them on here and keep them all nice and straight when I glue them up. So it's more of a gluing jig help keep things nice and straight. Okay, I'm going to cut two of these segmented discs that were glued with the epoxy, and I'm using the same 3/4 inch 14 teeth per inch blade on my bandsaw, which I've never tried on a segmented disc before, but I'm going to give it a try. So I think we're all set to do my first cut to square off the board. After squaring off the two segmented discs on the Accu-Slice system, the index knob was rotated one full turn to allow for the kerf of the bandsaw blade. The index knob was then rotated an additional 2 full turns to produce 1/100,000th inch thick segment layers. This process was repeated 8 times to produce a total of 16 segmented layers from each of these two segmented discs. From those two segmented discs I got 16 rings. So now I'm just get rid of the fuzzies. You can see some of the fuzzies on this compared to ones I just sanded. So all I do is just light sanding here. This is 220 grit sandpaper. Right around the perimeter. And then I get a piece of sandpaper on the inside. And then we'll have, so far, 16 layers for our tornado pattern bowl. I have one more disc with another 8 segments, so I'll have 24 segments. Well, with the epoxy, I glued these discs, and they're fairly strong. They look pretty good. So that first step went fairly well. And then I sliced the disc into thin slivers, which I'm going to make these tornado pattern bowls. So my next step is to glue these layers together. And I made these jigs, which go over the center post of the jig. And then I'll glue these rings one at a time together. Now I've done this in the past with Type Bond 2 glue, which works pretty well, because I can glue 2 or 3 of these together at one time, clamp them, and in 5 minutes the glue sets and they won't move after that. The epoxy is going to be a little more challenging in that I'm afraid that they're going to move after I start gluing them. And it would take too much time to glue 2 or 3 at a time and just keep doing it and keep mixing it. I got to be able to do them all at once. So I'll be trying it out to see how it works. I'm going to use a little different epoxy. This is a 1-to-1 mix. It's a little bit thicker epoxy, and we'll see how it works out. So again, I have my beakers. I'll be mixing probably 20 mils of each of these, give me 40 mils of glue total, and then I'll glue these layers one at a time, clamp them for a few seconds, and try putting a second layer on, and we'll see how it works. I did make some additional parts for these jigs. I made some flat rings, that I'll put on the bottom. And then on the top, I'll put another ring, and then when I clamp it, it'll give me a nice clamped ring. And hopefully it won't move once the glue's been set for a few seconds. And I did that for both of these sets of rings. So after I get it set, I got to take it off these jigs. I don't want to glue into this center post. It takes too much time to take it off on the lathe. So let's get started. We'll mix some glue up and we'll give this system a try. I'll start with the small disc first. So I put my 20 mils of the hardener in this beaker. Now I add my 20 mils of the epoxy. This thoroughly. See, it's quite a bit thicker than the previous batch that I made with the thinner epoxy. The epoxy resin glue is applied to only the top surface of the segmented ring layers. After thoroughly coating the segmented disc with the epoxy, the segmented disc is placed onto the manual gluing jig. This manual gluing jig is very helpful in the gluing and clamping of the segmented rings. It minimizes the movement of the rings when gluing to just a rotational movement, which makes clamping of the segmented rings much easier. Epoxy resin is applied to the second disc in the same manner, and the segmented disc is placed onto the manual on top of the previous disc. The disc is then rotated to the correct position. In this case, I aligned the second disc so that the joints alternated between the two layers. This not only produces your tornado pattern, but gives the segmented projects its maximum strength. This process is repeated for each of the remaining disc layers. At each stage, check the alignment and position of each disc to complete your tornado pattern. Adjust the individual layers as necessary. Due to the long setup time for the epoxy resin glues, you can readjust any of the layers for up to half an hour. This is one of the main advantages of using the epoxy resins. After adding all the glued segmented discs to the mandrel, double check and realign each of the layers as necessary. Add the plywood disc on top of the layers and clamp with some spring clamps. You need to be very careful because some of the layers, in particular the top layer, might move slightly during this clamping, which will require additional realignment. I have found that rubber bands actually work better for the clamping, resulting in less movement of the layers during this initial glue up and clamping. The mandrel can be removed at this time, or you can leave it in for an additional 10 to 15 minutes, just to make sure that it is removed before the epoxy starts to set. Next, I'm gluing up the larger segmented disc assembly, which contains a total of 16 segmented discs. Repeat the process of applying epoxy to each of the layers and align each layer at every gluing step. After the last layer has been attached to the mandrel, add the top plywood disc on top of the layers and clamp with some larger spring clamps. After attaching 4 of the spring clamps, I removed the mandrel because I felt there was little chance of the disc moving at this time. Additional spring clamps were then added. After the epoxy is set for 10 to 15 minutes, I removed the clamps and then removed the plywood disc because I did not want them to become glued to the segmented assembly. I then placed a small sheet of wax paper on both sides of the segmented assembly and added 2 small plywood discs on top and bottom of each segmented assembly and reclamped the assembly. This was done to avoid the plywood from being epoxy glued to the segmented disc assembly. Later, these plywood discs were easily removed from the segmented disc assembly. The process is then repeated for the second segmented disc assembly. Okay, these 2 tornado pattern segments that I glued together I now took over to my edge sander, sanded the faces to get rid of the glue, and also sanded the surface area here so I could actually see the pattern that I can better align it to glue it. So next I'm going to epoxy glue these 2 sections together, and in addition I have my top, which is going to be 3 layers, and my bottom, which is 3 layers, matching 3 layers, and I'm going to glue those 3 segments each together. So then I just have 3 pieces to put together for the final assembly. So I made some more epoxy, this thicker epoxy, which I'm going to be using from now on. And let me just start gluing this up. I'm going to try just letting that set for a while, because as soon as I put a clamp on it, it moved. So now I'll go ahead and glue up the top. The top and bottom sections are each composed of 3 layers, and these 2 assemblies are mirror images of each other. The top layer is made from Spanish cedar and is 1/2 inch thick, followed by a 100,000 inch thick Accu-Slice black layer, and then a 1/8 inch thick maple wood layer. Each segment layer contains 18 segments per disc. Epoxy resin is applied to all the layers, and the 3 segment layers are then clamped together with spring clamps. If any movement of the layers occurs, they are realigned as needed. The bottom layer is then epoxy glued, as was done for the top layer. I had some difficulty gluing the 2 main multi-layered segmented disc assemblies together. Since I had no manual to keep the 2 assemblies aligned with each other, the 2 layers slipped as soon as I applied 1 clamp. The solution was to use rubber bands to clamp the 2 assemblies. After attaching the rubber bands, I was still able to realign the 2 components so that they were in perfect alignment. Additional rubber bands are added for increased clamping force. We have our 3 multi-layered segmented rings, which are glued up with epoxy, beginning with our base layer, which is 3 layers, again 18 segments per layer. Our middle layer, which consists of 25 layers with our tornado pattern. And then our top layer, which is actually a mirror image of the bottom layer, again 3 layers. These were all cleaned up a little bit on the wire wheel and the sanding disc to get rid of most of the excess epoxy. I'll next glue these on the lathe. First of all, gluing this to a faceplate on the lathe, then gluing the tornado pattern piece on top with epoxy, and then the top ring once again with epoxy. So when it's finished, it'll look like this, and then we'll turn this down to a small bowl. Well, the bottom plate's been glued to a faceplate, and now I'm ready to glue the tornado pattern 25 layer segmented ring to the bottom layer. So I mix up some epoxy up here, and you notice this segmented ring I've mounted into a rotating tailstock that I can rotate it to match up the alternating rings, so that my last ring, alternating ring here, is midpoint in the ring here. And then we lock it in place. Our segmented bowl is all glued up. This is all glued with epoxy cement. And now we're ready to start turning. I'll turn on the outside first, and then I'll turn the inside to get it close to a shape. This is the resulting tornado pattern bowl. It came off the lathe. All these layers were glued with epoxy. And you get the same pattern inside. So next we'll give this a couple coats of shellac and then a couple coats of polyurethane to finish it. This is the finished tornado pattern bowl produced using epoxy resins for gluing all the layers. The bowl has 25 layers in the center here, alternating tornado pattern segments, 3 separate layers top and bottom. And after it came off the lathe, I gave it 3 coats of shellac and then 2 coats of polyurethane. In conclusion, I'm quite pleased with the epoxy cement in making these segmented bowls. Yes, it's a little bit sloppier, but actually the longer setup time I think is an advantage because you can move pieces after they've been glued together. And I find that rubber bands works best for doing a lot of the clamping. So I'll continue to make some more bowls using the epoxy resin, and we'll see how they hold up long term.